Good evening. I'd like to thank YAF, the Centennial Institute, and the 2022 Western Conservative Summit for having me here. The words American West invoke many images in our heads when we hear it. Some people think of cowboys on horseback, old-time deputies like Wyatt Earp, running the gangs out of Tombstone. It's more of a Hollywood view of the Wild West. Some people think of the gold miners heading westward, risking everything, life and limb, with the prospect of building a life better for their children than they have for themselves. Some people think of courageous explorers like John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark. All of those are perfectly fine reactions to a pivotal time in our nation's history, but what did all those people have in common? They held a particular set of values, the same values which spurred our forefathers to establish this amazing nation in the first place: faith, family, and liberty. I'd like to start off with a quote. I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations. End quote. President James Madison. This past February, I was privileged enough to take a trip with my family to James Madison's plantation home and resting place, Montpelier, in Orange County, Virginia. I had the honor to pay my respects to our fourth president at his home, nestled deep in the Virginia foothills, far separated from the motion of our world. Now, Madison is buried in a small family cemetery. It's only about a quarter mile across the field from his actual plantation home, surrounded only by his wife and several of his family members. What struck me most was just how silent it was. Couldn't help but think to myself how astonishing it was that I was standing just 10 feet or so from the resting site of a man who undeniably changed history for the world. All I could ask myself was, where is everyone else? Why is this not a big deal to anyone else? Why hasn't every single American flocked to this grave like a pilgrimage to Mecca? Why did I not need to wait in a 5-hour-long line for a moment as humbling as this? At first, I thought the reason was just because I was way more of a history nerd than anybody else. But I think it actually goes a lot deeper than that. I think this was by design. You see, our founding fathers had a profound understanding of the concept of self-governance. In fact, they came up with the idea in the first place. They saw the role of the federal government as no more than an entity built to protect the individual rights from the encroachment of others, and from a potentially tyrannical government in the future. Whereas up to that point in the world, governments were in fact utilized as the mechanisms of encroachment. It was the founding fathers of the United States of America who, for the first time in world history, declared that rights come from God, not from any government. Additionally, our founding fathers understood perfectly that a people with only rights and no values or responsibilities is bound to consume itself and devolve into chaos. President Madison, along with President Washington, President Jefferson, and all the others who helped to establish this great nation, interpreted the concept of self-governance through the lens of the value they placed on their faith and family. Let's look at President Washington as an example. Of course, the first president of the United States, he set the precedent for all presidents who would succeed him. He very deliberately purported that the role of president of the United States was too big for no man. The president was elected from among the people, by the people, to govern on behalf of the people. He was no king, no dictator, no god, no deity, but a president. He could have very easily built himself a magnificent shrine or temple, something to be buried in. Big, beautiful. I mean, after all, that's what all the other world leaders before him had done. Who would have even questioned it? He was widely, nearly unanimously revered by the people. He could have gotten away with it. But no. Instead, he retired quietly to his home in Mount Vernon. He died in his bed. A peaceful passing we can all wish for ourselves one day. He spent his final days in the love and embrace of his wife, Martha, beside whom he is now buried for all eternity. It goes for President Madison. After being president of the United States, he retired to his plantation at Montpelier, lived out his days humbly and quietly. See, what Washington and Madison understood is that while they had the right to build whatever magnificent edifices they wanted to ensure their legacy would be preserved for all time, instead they chose to live out their days with their families, continuing to observe their faith as humble servants of God. They understood that they had a fundamental responsibility to adhere to their faith and values. This is the main crux of what I want to talk about today. The way in which our responsibility to adhere to our values is absolutely vital to preserving a system of self-governance. As much as I would love to spend the entirety of my time here honoring our forefathers, I think we should turn our attention to how we can take those principles that motivated them then and reapply them to our life today. There's no question in my mind that at its deepest level, the biggest divide between the left and right today is the value we place on the importance of self-governance. The left is adamant about expanding the size and influence of centralized power. Whether that means draining power from individual states to surrender to an ever-growing federal bureaucracy, or they can also mean crowding out any opposing voices in the culture, on social media, public education, higher education, the entertainment industry, the list goes on. They do this very meticulously, and they've been doing it for decades now. They never came out explicitly and stated they were embarking on a hostile takeover of all of our cultural and political systems. And in fact, I would add, they didn't even start off by actually infringing on any of our rights. See, they understood from the get-go that in our system of governance, the foundation upon which our rights are upheld are our values. So they began to chip away at our values first. They came for our system of marriage when they incentivized single motherhood in the 1960s. Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty has resulted in probably more long-lasting and systemic poverty in the United States than nearly any other bloated government policy of its time. Whether that's simply ironic or malicious, you be the judge. Government agents went door to door offering to replace the fundamental role of men and husbands with government welfare. The effect of this was twofold. First, men were relieved of their fundamental responsibility to care and provide for their families, and were instead given an option to abandon them. And second, rates of single motherhood, especially in urban areas, skyrocketed to heights never before seen in American history, rates which still climb higher today. The effect of this policy is a perfect example of how the left eroded the foundation of values on which our rights are based. See, a society where men not only have the right to abandon their families, but where it's actually incentivized and subsidized by the federal government is without question worse off than a society where that right may still exist, but men instead feel the moral duty to stay, provide, be a father, and to be a husband. Next, the left came for our faith and our religion, both in the freedom to practice it publicly and in the attempt to turn one's confidence and conviction in his or her religion into something culturally taboo or bizarre. Just to clarify, when I say our faith and our religion, I do not mean that we all have to share a particular faith or religion. What I mean is the shared value we place on our personal right to believe and to exercise that belief as proudly and as publicly as we wish. With that said, the tide of aggression from the left was undoubtedly aimed at Christianity in particular. It was left-wing school boards and state legislatures who forcefully removed any reference to Christianity from our schools. Crosses on the wall, prayers in the classroom, even going so far in several states as to disallow the reciting of the pledge in the morning because it contains the phrase, "under God." It's clear that the more sinister motive behind these insidious actions was to ensure that our children were spending 8 or 9 hours per day in school, being completely isolated from anything which remotely resembles the same Judeo-Christian values our country was built on. Again, they attacked the values first underneath the surface, and they started early in grade school to ensure the next generation of children would grow up already holding a disdain for the American ideal and the American way. Now, just a couple decades later, the rates of atheism and agnosticism, especially among the youth, have skyrocketed. Eroding the value we place in our faith has resulted, inevitably, in the restriction of our right to adhere to our faith by the left. Look no further than the baker right here in Colorado, who was viciously attacked by left-wing activists who tried to literally shut his business down for no more than observing his personal religious principles. Or when Obamacare was passed, which required private businesses to provide contraceptives and in some cases even abortions for their employees, whether that infringed on their rights or not. We all remember Hobby Lobby and Sisters of the Poor, right? The left are the ones who weaponize government institutions and cultural movements against us. First they came for our values, then they came for our rights. For decades now, elected Republicans and the conservative movement in general has been fighting on defense. The left has controlled all the major cultural institutions in this country for many years now. Finally, we're seeing a significant shift in that power dynamic. We see prominent Republicans finally utilizing their political power to pull the cover off major corporations, especially big tech, for cramming their left-wing ideology down the throats of their employees and consumers. Many of these companies acquiesce to the left out of fear of being canceled from the very loud, very active 15% of Americans who are radical leftists, who are willing to destroy anything in the path to get to what they consider utopia. However, these companies are now being offered a new option to actually stand up for traditional American values such as faith, family, and liberty. Because guess what? The percentage of us who believe strongly in those foundational values is a lot higher than 15%. And we all buy their products. We will not let them bully us into submission. The left came for our foundational values first because they came for our rights. We must stand up for our values, because if we don't, then fighting for our rights back will mean nothing. We have a moral obligation to stand up for what we believe in, to claim back the founding principles of self-governance through adherence to our faith and family. If we aren't going to fight on behalf of our values, Frankly, we're undeserving of liberty. If I'm making this sound urgent, it's because it is. We must turn the tide now before it's too late. So just as the pioneers and explorers of the American Wild West would say, let's saddle up and ride into a new era of liberty, one built on values of faith, family, and freedom. Thank you, and God bless you.